Today's topic, quoting Lenin. What is to be done in Zimbabwe? The most compelling and convincing evidence in support of the continuation of targeted sanctions against individuals and companies in Zimbabwe was, ironically, provided by ZANU-PF itself. In football, they say the team has scored its own goal. The behavior of ZANU-PF leadership and its hired thugs in the past 4 weeks was the loudest statement that sanctions must continue. It has been stated repeatedly that the targeted sanctions will be removed if ZANU-PF regime respects human rights, the rule of law, democracy, freedom of expression, and free and fair elections. This is written in the Zidera law that imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe. Under the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, or Zidera, of 2001 and amended in 2019, the President of the United States of America is authorized to lift the sanctions once he has certified that Zimbabwe is either complying or making positive and measurable steps towards complying with the conditions for the lifting of sanctions. To help Zimbabwe and the regional states, SADC adopted principles and guidelines concerning free and fair elections. These principles state what free and fair elections mean. The SADC principles state that free elections means fundamental human rights and freedoms are adhered to during the electoral processes, and that includes freedom of speech and expression of the electoral stakeholders and freedom of assembly and association, and that freedom of access to information and the right to transmit and receive political messages by citizens is upheld. That the principles of equal and universal adult suffrage are observed, in addition to the voters' right to exercise their franchise in secret and register their complaints without undue restrictions or repercussions. The SADC principles also state that fair elections means electoral processes that are conducted in conformity with established rules and regulations, managed by an impartial, non-partisan professional and competent electoral management body in an atmosphere characterized by the respect for the rule of law, guaranteed rights of protection for citizens through the electoral law and the Constitution, and reasonable opportunities for voters to transmit and receive voter information, defined by equitable access to financial and material resources for all political parties and independent candidates in accordance with the national laws and where there is no violence, intimidation, or discrimination based on race, gender, ethnicity, religious, or other considerations specified in these SADC principles and guidelines governing democratic elections. These SADC principles and guidelines concerning free and fair elections are exactly the same conditions in ZIDERA for the lifting or removal of targeted sanctions. The ZANU-PF regime has violated the most fundamental of these SADC principles. As a matter of fact, the ZANU-PF regime has violated the 99.99% of the SADC principles, which are the basis, which are the condition for the removal of sanctions. In the process, the actions by the ZANU-PF regime amount to perpetuating and providing evidence for the continuation of sanctions, strange as that might sound. But the fact of the matter, as I said before, is ZANU-PF is contributing towards the continuation of sanctions. According to Veritas, a website that provides information on the work of the Parliament of Zimbabwe and the laws of Zimbabwe, one of the most repressive laws, the Public Order and Security Act, POSA, was repealed, but it was replaced with the almost identical Maintenance of Peace and Order Act. The Act governs gatherings, processions, and public demonstrations, and thus impacts the freedom of assembly and expression in Zimbabwe. The Zimbabwean authorities have used COVID-19 lockdown measures to restrict Zimbabweans' freedom of movement, forcing travelers to undergo stringent document checks at roadblocks. Journalists have also been targeted by the authorities, despite being classified as essential, with 2 arrested for violating lockdown measures. Authorities forcibly dispersed an anti-government protest in Harare in July, physically attacking and arresting participants. Earlier that month, journalist Hopewell Chingono and civil society leader Jacob Ngarivume were arrested in connection with the rally. Ngarivume was bailed in September, while Chingono was arrested on other charges in November of 2020. In March, the Supreme Court ruled that the Movement for Democratic Change Alliance leader Nelson Chamisa was not the legitimate opposition leader, replacing him with Movement for Democratic Change Tsvangirai MDC-T leader Thokozani Kupe in a move that was regarded as a ZANU-PF attempt to fracture the opposition. Kupe recalled at least 31 MDC Alliance legislators as the year progressed, forcing them to surrender their seats. The Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, or ZEC, is responsible for election management and oversight, but its independence from ZANU-PF has long been questioned. International election monitors criticized aspects of its management of the 2018 polls, noting vote count stewardship, opaque procurement processes, and the irregular arrangement of the ballots themselves, which appeared to favor certain candidates, notably Mnangagwa. Political parties and civil society had difficulty accessing voter rolls, affecting audit and verification processes envisioned by the Electoral Act. According to the United States 2020 country reports on human rights practices in Zimbabwe, numerous factors contributed to a flawed overall election process, and this included the Zimbabwe Election Commission's lack of independence, heavily biased state media favoring the ruling party, voter intimidation, unconstitutional influence of tribal leaders, especially chiefs, disenfranchisement of the diaspora voters, failure to provide a preliminary voters roll in electronic format, politicization of food aid, security services' excessive use of force, and lack of precision and transparency around the release of election results. The election resulted in the formation of a government led by ZANU-PF, with a supermajority in the National Assembly, but not in the Senate. The Constitution provides for freedom of expression and of the media, but the law limits these freedoms in what the government calls the interests of defense, public security, or professional confidentiality. The government continued to arrest, detain, and harass journalists and critics. While independent media continued to operate, journalists and editors practiced self-censorship. Government failure to investigate or prosecute attacks on human rights defenders and peaceful protesters led to de facto restrictions on freedom of expression, assembly, and association. Zimbabwe has only one locally based TV station that is government-owned and controlled. All other countries in the SADC regions have many television stations that are independently owned and locally based. And this speaks volumes about media freedom in Zimbabwe. According to Tony Riller, writing in the publication The Daily Maverick, the latest in repressive laws in Zimbabwe are the proposed amendments to the Private Voluntary Organizations Act. They reflect how deeply the ZANU-PF government fears its citizens. NGOs in Zimbabwe enjoy a much higher confidence ranking from the citizens than the government leaders. A survey by Afrobarometer showed that 79% of Zimbabweans trust NGOs. Rila notes that while this law, Private Voluntary Organizations Act, is ostensibly to prevent money laundering for terrorist activities, Section 6.1 clearly shows the intent of the government, for it makes it a criminal offense for NGOs to provide funding to political parties. These actions by the ZANU-PF government under Mnangagwa that clearly deprive Zimbabweans of their basic human rights show what the government must not do if it wants sanctions to be lifted. It is now common knowledge that the ZANU-PF government has absolutely no respect for basic human rights. A key question at this juncture is, what is the way forward for Zimbabweans? This brings to the topic of this letter from America. What is to be done? This is exactly the same historic question the founder of the Russian Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin, posed in 1902. Indeed, what is to be done in Zimbabwe for the citizens to regain their basic human rights, their dignity, and their country? What indeed is to be done? In his letter from jail, young human rights activist Makomborero Haruziwishe made some three important points that partly address this historic question: what is to be done? Makomborero argues that oppressed Zimbabweans are many, more than 14 million. ZANU-PF oppressors are just a few in comparison. The strength of the Zimbabweans to defeat their oppressors lies in their numbers. This is the first point Makomborero makes. The second point Makomborero makes is Zimbabweans must stop agonizing and start organizing. It has been observed that Zimbabweans spend most of their time agonizing and lamenting their fate under the iron grip of the ZANU-PF oppressors. The third point Makomborero makes is Zimbabweans are the people they have been waiting for to free them from the oppressive ZANU rule. In other words, Zimbabweans must look at themselves, organize and strategize instead of looking for someone else to come and rescue them. The late ZANU leader Ndabadingi Sitole had a clarion call, and that was, we are our own liberators. Lenin in 1902 Russia argued that what was to be done was the formation of what he called a vanguard movement, or a group of very dedicated individuals who will trailblaze mass action against oppressive rule. The vanguard movement strategy was implemented with varying degrees of success in Russia, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Sudan, and other countries around the world. Zimbabweans came very close to effective mass mobilization when, a few years ago, they embraced the mantra "Zvakwana, kusikufande kupi, sokwanele, enough is enough." Makomborero Zvisina Washe is one of many emerging Zimbabwean young people who are trailblazing the vanguard movement mantra. But another key question arises. When the call for mass action is made, will Zimbabwean citizens heed the call, as happened in countries that I mentioned above? There are 4 scenarios based on how other dictators in Africa have fallen that could bring an end to 41 years of ZANU-PF hegemonic misrule in the country. One scenario would be ZANU-PF could lose at the next elections, but the chances of it accepting defeat are very low, given that ZANU-PF now controls the electoral process. ZANU-PF Stalinist mantra on elections is modeled after how Soviet leader Stalin described election results or defined election results. Joseph Stalin reportedly said, "It's not the people who vote that counts. It's the people who count the votes." Stalin was reported to have also said, "It is enough that the people know there was an election. The people who cast the votes decide nothing. The people who count the votes decide everything." The second scenario would be a split within ZANU-PF, a significant split within ZANU-PF that could end up with one faction potentially aligning with the opposition MDC alliance to win power at the elections or by other means. But there have been many opportunities for such splits, as shown in 2017 when Mugabe was removed from his position. Ultimately, the warring factions within ZANU-PF came to some form of accommodating each other. The third scenario would be the army could intervene. Under the so-called Joint Operations Command, or JOC, the army wields overwhelming influence and control on ZANU-PF party and government. But there are 2 possible outcomes of military interventions under this scenario. One outcome would be the army could intervene to strengthen a divided ZANU-PF as it did in 2017. Or the other outcome could be that the military intervention would end up weakening ZANU-PF political power. This possibility of removing ZANU-PF by the army appears unlikely, at least on the surface. However, some observers have noticed that the army command structure in Zimbabwe is now increasingly being filled by new officers who were born after independence and have no association with the armed liberation struggle. The so-called old guard in the army are retiring because of age and are giving way to a new generation that identifies itself with the youthful leadership in the opposition MDC alliance. This new generation of military officers could see their future aligned with the youthful Zimbabwean population. Remember, more than 70% of the Zimbabwean population is under 30 years of age. One could say more than 70% of the Zimbabwean population was born after independence. To this extent, military intervention would be in favor of the opposition parties. A case in point, in 1975, young Portuguese soldiers rebelled against fighting to preserve Portuguese colonialism in Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique. These young officers overthrew the Portuguese government and established a new dispensation that led to the independence for the former colonies. Another case, Thomas Sankara staged a coup, a military coup in Burkina Faso in 1983 to establish a regime that became more sensitive and more receptive to the people's needs. Sankara was viewed by supporters as a charismatic and iconic figure of revolution, and he was commonly referred to as Africa's Che Guevara. The fourth scenario that could lead to the downfall of the ZANU-PF would be a spontaneous and continuous mass uprising like those in Tunisia, Egypt, Sudan, and elsewhere. This kind of continuing mass protests has a very high likelihood of removing ZANU-PF from power. However, the question on the prospect of mass protests in Zimbabwe is: what is the likelihood that Zimbabwean citizens will heed the clarion call for a mass uprising? And the historic question, what is to be done in Zimbabwe, should raise the Zimbabwean narrative from agonizing to organizing. As Magomborero so philosophically wrote in his letter from jail, we Zimbabweans are who we have